Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. In the news this week, Amazon has bought 007. I thought I'd talk about that and some British family firms. On the 20th of February 2025, Amazon MGM Studios, Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli announced that they have formed a new joint venture to house the James Bond intellectual property rights, and those parties will remain co-owners of the franchise. Under the terms of the new venture, Amazon MGM Studios will gain creative control of the James Bond franchise following closure of the transaction. Everybody in my social media channels has been talking about this. AJ Chowdhury has been talking about this on BBC Breakfast, Mark O'Connell on Sky News, and of course independent content creators such as David Zaritsky and Calvin Dice on YouTube, and a whole host of others in the James Bond community on Instagram. Everyone has been talking about it. I haven't posted anything yet. I haven't actually watched these yet. I thought I'd produce my own take first and then cycle back and have a look at theirs. Although I was asked about it by a member of the clergy in church on Sunday. The future of the 007 franchise is, of course, completely unknowable, but it's not out in a complete contextual void. So I thought we could have a look at both the overall context and some comparisons to long-running family business, or rather businesses throughout the UK. So we'll be talking about other British firms, I'll be talking about other British franchises, and should note that this James Bond news actually only applies to the movies. It doesn't apply to the books, which are published by Ian Fleming Publications, which are totally separate from the movies, something that was a surprise to me when I think AJ Chowdhury was telling me about this, because I'm used to Star Wars books where, especially in the expanded universe days, tie-ins were very, very close, and you might have a character introduced in a comic book who would then appear in the movie later on, and Star Trek, where writers and producers such as Jerry Taylor, who worked on The Next Generation and Star Trek Voyager, should also pen tie-in novels. So I'm used to the idea of book and film being tied in, but Bond, that's not the case. Even if they may seem very, very similar with new spin-off novels, say in the 1990s with the Raymond Benson novels, they seemed Bronson-esque, although they could also seem very Ian Fleming-esque, but it wasn't a direct tie-in. Some people might ask, is the 007 series really comparable? For some, it is absolutely not comparable to Star Wars or Star Trek or other franchises. Some people don't particularly like the word franchise being applied to it. It's unique. And I can agree to that to a certain extent, in the same way that all businesses and all franchises, I will use the word, have to have a unique selling point. I'll add into this, I graduated with a Masters in Business from the UK's oldest business school with the highest grade for research ever awarded, and I was invited to undertake a PhD in my area, which was charting management decisions using financial data in closed industries, ones which were not so inclined to release public information, but you could track cash to track decisions. Anyway, I chose to take an actual career in management instead, specifically in education management, and at various points on that route I taught business courses, usually weekend courses to middle managers or high-level employees, one-to-one, especially throughout southern China. I used to be zoomed around to teach these courses. I also did this with Chinese government-owned investment companies, one-to-one with some of the more senior investors in South China and Communist Party officials. This was part of my role as a manager in the world's largest education company in their largest market, China. More recently, back in the UK, I've been overseeing management research, including working with Nobel Prize winner in economics, many business founders and CEOs, a board director at Warner Brothers. Whether they go home and talk about me, I have no idea, but they have thanked me in their books. So to that end, I see this Bond news as more business news than a kind of who will play James Bond. To that point, probably an actor. So, is Bond comparable? I feel it's worth addressing that question first before I move into kind of other areas. And I'll say that I worked for one company, and I won't name which one so I don't embarrass former colleagues. One company I worked for started from the point that it was so huge that industry benchmarking, pay, conditions, training, product, etc. Was completely irrelevant. They were the trendsetters, so you shouldn't be following trends by benchmarking against others. The others kind of weren't worth thinking about. I strongly argued against this, relatively new coming into that company, and market research showed our companies were considering our nearest competitors, and internal research showed employees were considering careers in other companies too. I was really interested in what a huge resistance there was to comparing ourselves to others, but we were able to get movement, we were able to get benchmarking, and it worked out for customers, for employees, and ultimately for management. So why was there such resistance in comparing ourselves to others? Well, I imagine it's because, as the traditional saying goes, comparison is the theft of joy. We all like to think that there's no one we can be compared to, and for companies, when you invest so much of your time and your energy in the success of one particular company, which as a manager could be the success of your team, your department, your overall company, it can seem really hard to think of your company as one of, but ultimately it is true, and making cold, hard comparisons can really help you make the progress you need. On the more negative side, which I don't often highlight too much, or dwell upon too much, I've recently left a company which I felt was poorly managed, where old hands were absolutely insistent that the company should never be compared to other companies in the same industry. They were kind of suspicious of lessons learned from elsewhere, sometimes hostile, as if saying another company does this was some kind of personal insult. I'm not the only person to leave, not the only person to note this tendency. The overall health of the company isn't looking great. Ideas from elsewhere might help, and I hope it does help eventually, because I've got friends still there. But it's interesting. There's a real resistance to saying my company, my franchise, my whatever can be compared to something else. Many companies have actually failed through this, or come close to failure through a similar mindset. Perhaps the most famous one, the business school favourite in the UK, is Marks and Spencer's. Simple hubris. At one time dominant, Marks and Spencer's came close to bankruptcy before bouncing back through reinvigorated management. Their quality had been the best in Britain, perhaps the best in the world, starting out from a little market stall here in Leeds, which I have visited. They grew and grew and grew, and then stopped. They institutionalized. Other companies started raising their standards, until suddenly Marks and Sparks found themselves being overtaken. They were no longer the best, not because they changed, but because, through believing themselves to be different, incomparable, and therefore better, they stayed still when others were moving forwards. They were overtaken in almost every aspect of their business. They were being beaten at their own game, and it took a huge shift to get them back to the top of UK retail, win over a new generation, especially through their food outlets, for young professionals. Now, this is a wonderful case study for almost all business schools throughout the UK. They succeeded, but they'd rested on their laurels, closed their minds to comparisons, and they were nearly sunk. Now, a non-British example from Denmark actually would be Lego. Founded in 1932, it remains in the founding family's hands. For a book on family business, and for a great business read generally, I'd suggest the 2014 book, Brick by Brick, How Lego Rewrote the Rules of Innovation and Conquered the Global Toy Industry, by David Robertson and Bill Breen. A lot of toil involved to get Lego right back to the top. Again, a company that's gone backwards and forwards in terms of success, but again, this was a 2014 book, more than 10 years old, and it's still, Brick by Brick, is still one of the best business books I've ever read. Just for those who are unaware of the ins and outs of the Bond films, it's worth saying that this may be a huge turning point, Amazon buying out the rights, but it's not necessarily the first time we've seen significant change in the series. Ian Fleming, of course, wrote the books that were phenomenally successful, but was determined pretty early on, if not from the very start, to make money out of them by TV, by movies, by anything. I mean, he wrote a screenplay with Jack Whittingham and the filmmaker Kevin McClory. Wasn't released as a film in Ian Fleming's lifetime, but he did turn it into a novel, Thunderball, leading to legal ramifications for decades after his death. He sold the film rights, the first Bond novel, to Gregory Ratoff for $600 US. Gregory then immediately, within a week, sold the rights on to CBS television for $1,000 and then bought the film rights outright for $6,000. Hence, Casino Royale would not be adapted as a kind of proper Bond film until the 21st century, although we did have the 1967 parody with Woody Allen and David Niven. Even from the very start, even from the 50s, we get multiple different ways the Bond franchise might be going, and in 1954 we get Jimmy Bond. 1954's Casino Royale, an episode of the American anthology series Climax. The show was the first screen adaptation of a James Bond novel. It stars Barry Nelson as James Bond, another character addresses him as Jimmy, Peter Lorre as the villain, Peter Lorre, and he is generally said to be the best aspect of it. I watched it pretty recently and actually thought Linda Christian was a real highlight. She played Valerie Mathis, a combination of Vesper and Mathis from the book. I think she gets overlooked. I think she's really, really good, and in many ways I think the romance is better written than, many of the later James Bond romances, so I think it's a pity that Linda Christian gets overlooked. The programme was originally broadcast live, so it's got that theatrical style to it. It's very, very 50s, and I'm told it was originally in colour, but the only existing versions are both in black and white due to recording methods. Now, of course, in the 60s, we get Saltzman, we get Broccoli, adapting them to be the Bond films that we kind of know and love. Saltzman, the movie producer, Broccoli, the movie agent, and if you really want an insight into that, you can't do better, I believe, than Some Kind of Hero, the remarkable story of the James Bond films by Matthew Wood and A.J. Chowdhury. I think they have the best insight into how we got from book to screen. And of course the Sean Connery James Bond films were an absolute juggernaut, meaning that when he got tired, when he got fed up, when he wanted to leave, James Bond was considered to be absolutely dead. Bond is dead. Long live Bond. George Lazenby came in as a quick replacement, really. A long casting process, great stories behind it that are well known among Bond fans, but he was essentially Connery with the same style, with the same look, for the most part. There were some updates and upgrades, but for the most part he was supposed to be the same style of Bond as Sean Connery in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is now a much better regarded film than it may have been at the time. Of course, Connery came back for one last hurrah in Diamonds Are Forever, and then we get Roger Moore. And for many who were kind of real Bond fans, but particularly Sean Connery fans, when Moore took over, that was the death of Bond when Live and Let Die came out. Roger Moore was, of course, a counter-adaptation in many ways. He took different aspects of Bond, so it's bourbon, not martini. There's no black tie in Live and Let Die. There's no Q. There's no DB5 ever. In his run, we don't have the classic Aston Martin DB5. And Roger Moore always said that his Bond was more of a lover than a fighter. And ultimately, as Bond goes out into space, well, I think he does it with much more aplomb than Connery had when he was wearing a spacesuit in You Only Live Twice. But many fans switched off at that point. And of course that also marks the band falling out. 1975, Saltzman leaves Eon, and Eon production becomes Cubby. From now on, it becomes a Cubby Broccoli show. So we already have, by the mid-70s, we've got a few different points: TV adaptations, legal problems, adaptations, stars leaving, even in its first 15 years or so. Even then, we get some real big changes, and yet we get some real successes. 1981, For Your Eyes Only, one of my favourite, say, underrated Bonds, and I did a podcast on this a little while ago. For Your Eyes Only was a real hard reset, going back to the Ian Fleming short stories, really, going back to the this is implausible but not impossible kind of story. And of course then we get the real terror for the Bond films when Kevin McClory comes back, and he's going to make his rival Bond film with Sean Connery, Never Say Never Again, released 1983, the same year as Octopussy with Roger Moore. So we have what the papers love to call Battle of the Bonds, and I think Octopussy is a great film to watch, because then you get the question, well, how many of those Eon production elements, not the Ian Fleming ones, but the Eon production ones, the way Q is, for example, Moneypenny as a strong character, so many aspects are dialed up to 11 that it becomes almost more of a Bond film than all the other Bond films combined. If you only watch one Bond film, I think Octopussy, one of the classics, then Octopussy would probably be the one to go to. After all the legal headaches, we have more legal headaches. We had that long gulf, 1989 to 1995. Seems long to a Bond fan, nothing for a Star Wars fan. But anyway, we don't get a third or fourth Timothy Dalton movie. Check out Mark Edlitz, by the way. He's a great, great author. I've had him as a guest on the podcast, and he wrote a brilliant book on the Lost Bonds, and he writes about what might have been. Those films were in development, couldn't get made because of legal problems. I have to say, those who want a more grounded Timothy Dalton adventure, more in the style of his film License to Kill, probably have been disappointed with the eventual result, with robot assassins and various other things that might be more suitable and did end up in an Austin Powers film. And then, of course, sadly in 1996 we get Cubby Broccoli's death, and of course the Bond franchise, as a movie franchise, passes from him to his, well, Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli, the step-siblings, who would really head Tomorrow Never Dies, which again, that seems really a tribute to Cubby Broccoli's style. So For Your Eyes Only is very much an Ian Fleming film. Tomorrow Never Dies feels to me a Cubby Broccoli film, before they really reach out into their own style in the 21st century. The overt reset with Casino Royale in 2006. A new timeline, everything new except Judi Dench, and her relationship as M with Bond is suddenly reversed. She has the reverse relationship with Daniel Craig than she did with Pierce Brosnan. She is new as M in GoldenEye, and Bond is the old hand, whereas in Casino Royale she is the old hand and Bond is the young blood. So that's a quick recap of the story so far for Bond. Many points where for many it might have died, or for some fans it did die, and yet it still continues. So we are not at necessarily a unique turning point, it has a context. As I was trying to make the point earlier, and I hope I didn't hammer home too hard, I don't see Bond as incomparable. There are other studios, much bigger studios in some cases, Warner Brothers, Disney, United Artists, and Lucasfilm, close to my heart. And they have not been multi-generational enterprises. Harry, Albert, Sam and Jack Warner founded the Warner Brothers movie studio in 1956. After some very tumultuous financial years, the brothers announced they were selling the studio they built, but Jack Warner secretly organised a syndicate to purchase 90% of the stock, so he retained control, much as Bruce Wayne / Batman does at the end of one of the Batman films, apparently selling it, but then buying it all back. And for a decade or so, he tried to retain control, but lost more and more and more influence over the years, and beyond the founders, control of the Warner Brothers studio went to investors. Walt Disney, of course, pioneered the Disney Corporation, but had one son, Roy Edward Disney, who was the last member of the Disney family to be actively involved in a company. Roy Disney also had a son who went into filmmaking, but the grandchild of Walt Disney did not run Disney, just as the grandchildren of Cubby Broccoli will not run Eon Productions. United Artists didn't even retain all of the founders in their own lifetime, let alone their sons, daughters or grandchildren. And George Lucas, of course, established Lucasfilm and LucasArts, trying to create some of his own independence, but he sold the whole thing to Disney. He does have adopted children, and they were involved with various projects in small roles, both sides of the camera, writing, extra work, little roles and so on. But October 30th, 2012, for $4.05 billion, George Lucas sold Star Wars, Lucasfilm, LucasArts, Indiana Jones, for $2.21 billion in cash, and 37,076,679 shares for that. He sold it. So Warner Brothers, Disney, United Artists, Lucasfilm, none of them have really become family dynasties. Of course, Bond is different. It's small, it's artisan, but in another way, it's not, and we haven't seen great filmmaking dynasties, so perhaps it's not surprising that the Broccolis will not become a dynasty themselves. As for other businesses, the UK does have a few very long-running family businesses. In fact, the oldest 20 family firms in the UK, according to Campton Family Business, a newsletter for all those interested in family businesses, the top 20 oldest family firms in the UK have collectively traded for 7,013 years altogether, trading on average for 350 years each. Whitechapel Bell Foundry was the oldest family firm in the country, dating back to 1420, having been owned by just two families since it was founded all those years ago until 2017. Now they're produced under license by Bells of Whitechapel Limited. Whitechapel Bell Foundry cast both the Liberty Bell in the United States and Big Ben, among many, 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 many others. The oldest family business now in the UK is R.J. Balston and Sons Limited. These are butchers in Bridport, Dorset, currently owned and run by the 26th generation of the founding family. They have operated in two locations, first in the local Shambles, and since 1892 from 9 West Allington, Bridport, perhaps a 5-6 minute walk away. In 2015 they celebrated 500 years as a family business, dating back to 1515 when Henry VIII was the King of England. According to their website, the book 500 Years Behind the Block by Richard J. Balston can be purchased at our shop, or give us a ring on 01308 422 638 and we can send it anywhere in the UK. Sorry for those outside the UK, but if you're in the US, there are a couple of copies knocking about on eBay. So it's a butcher that is the oldest one, and back in their 499th year, when they were still a young business, the Daily Telegraph did a feature on the butcher's history, which I found very interesting. Although he's interested in his family business's claim to fame, Richard Balston has never had the time to think about starting a history project. A butcher's life is busy from cradle to grave. He grew up above the shop and remembers his father warning him from an early age that the Balston butchers never earned enough for a retirement. So, very little information has been passed down to him about the 28 generations who worked in the family business before him. He said, "I worked with my dad every day for 40 years of my life. We had a special bond." He fondly relays a typical story about his father, who one day grew so fed up with a customer that he cut off the poor man's tie with a butcher's knife. Well, there are actually some historians interested in this, and there was a BBC programme about Balston and Sons butchers, and I talked about my own family's history of butchers in the south of England in a YouTube video about my grand-uncle killed in the Second World War in Italy, and I read out one of his final letters. The history of butchers is indeed interesting. I had a quick look at the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, just quickly. The business now beaten, and actually the most interesting thing I found was a 2012 blog article on the London Historians blog by Mike Patterson, and this amateur historian had visited, had been given a tour, took loads of pictures, so if you do have time to check out any of the things that I'm talking about, I would recommend this, the Whitechapel Bell Foundry London Historians blog article from 2012. Lots of great photographs, and you get the real passion of an amateur historian being guided round by those casting the bells. I thought I'd talk about some of the other interesting family businesses. For me, always interesting to talk about Josiah Wedgwood, porcelain maker from a family of porcelain makers going back 4 generations before him. He passed on his business to his son and grandson. Perhaps a little odd to talk about this guy as a potter, as he couldn't use a potter's wheel due to childhood smallpox that left his legs too weak to work the pedals of the potter's wheel. But as a salesman, he was gifted. So many common sales techniques like direct mail, money-back guarantees, free delivery, celebrity endorsement, illustrated catalogues, buy one get one free, it all came from Josiah Wedgwood. He was also an astute campaigner, most famously for the abolition of slavery. So he created the ceramic medallion in 1787 to support the abolition of the slave trade that featured a kneeling slave and the slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" He was also a passionate supporter of US independence and the French Revolution, motivated by his strong religious convictions. And they're walking a tightrope because he had these strong convictions, but also, aside from being a hard-headed businessman, was politically very strongly connected. So he was the potter to the king. Now, I should say, this isn't the oldest, or even the second oldest porcelain maker. There's an argument over which one it is, Royal Worcester or Royal Crown Derby. Both of them argue with each other over which one it is, but I thought Wedgwood was the most interesting, and I wanted to include a company with a creative element or bespoke in some way. No particular insult to butchers or bell makers. Perhaps I could mention Chippendale, not the male burlesque act that inspired the Full Monty, which stars Renard from The World Is Not Enough as a male stripper, but Thomas Chippendale. Great local first name, local to me, lived near Otley, son of a woodworker, and whose son followed him into cabinet maker. Again, you get kind of a generational business, very, very creative. Their name was given to an era's style of furniture, especially thanks to the book Thomas produced called The Gentleman and a Cabinet Maker's Director. So that was published in 1754, essentially an early mail order catalogue, but hugely influential in the UK, North America, and to a lesser extent the European continent. Hard to go around a stately home in the UK that doesn't have some Chippendale furniture. Again, that name being given to the style because of Thomas Chippendale, whether it's made by him or by one of his imitators. The business, it died out, I believe, with him, his son, but his son was a notable cabinet maker in his own right, and the family had been involved in the wood trade with successive businesses over the generations. There's a full-size sculpture of Thomas Chippendale in Otley, big statue, and one on the facade of the Victoria and Albert Museum. So again, he is a influential figure, but without a surviving business. And finally, to talk about, well, one of the oldest family-owned businesses in existence, possibly the second oldest in the UK, Lock & Co. Established in 1676, Lock & Co. is the oldest hat shop in the world. The company was founded in 1676 by Robert Davis. His son Charles continued the business and took James Lock on as an apprentice in 1747. James later married Charles Davis's only child, Mary, and when Davis died in 1759, James Lock inherited the company from his former master, and the Lock family, James's descendants, still own and run the company today. The shop has been in its current location since 1765. The company is responsible for the origination of what's popularly known as the bowler hat. In 1849, Edward Coke, nephew of Thomas Coke, 1st Earl of Leicester, and the younger brother of Thomas Coke, 2nd Earl of Leicester, requested a hat to solve the problem of gamekeepers' headgear. Traditional top hats were too fragile and too tall, often getting knocked off low branches for the job. The company commissioned London hat makers William and Thomas Bowler to solve the problem. Anecdotally, when Coke returned for his new hat, he dropped it on the floor and stamped on it twice to test its strength before paying 12 shillings and leaving satisfied. So it's popularly known as the bowler hat. I believe Lock & Co. prefer it to be called the Coke hat. But there is a family business, and one that has a strong connection to James Bond. Sean Connery wore a Lock & Co. hat in 1962's Dr. No, as discussed in From Tailors with Love, an evolution of menswear through the Bond films by Pete Brooker and Matt Spazer. They mention this as being the second oldest shop in Britain, the oldest being the butcher shop. The book notes that as the film is set in Jamaica and the hat concerned is felt trilby, Bond spends as much time fanning himself with the hat as he does wearing it. What colour it is actually very hard to say, as under different lighting it looks very, very different throughout the film, and the colour model, Sandown, has changed slightly over the years, but various people have described it as brown, green or grey with a hint of either. But you can see it for yourself by visiting the shop. These days they very, very much celebrate their James Bond connections. So there we go. A little insight into long-running family businesses, little insight into James Bond. What future does James Bond have under Amazon? Well, naturally, I just hope that it does have a future, that something does get made, and I really hope that something is good. Some people are worried because Amazon had made the Rings of Power. I'm sure that's not the only thing they made. They also made, of course, Jeremy Clarkson's series on his farm and the Grand Tour, which was great fun. Disney, of course, have made many changes to Star Wars, not all of which have been welcomed by fans, but there has been some great content, to use a word that allegedly Barbara Broccoli does not like. There have been hits, and there have been not so hits. So, as I say, I'm just hoping that whatever the future holds, it'll be fun. But it's uncertain. It's uncertain as all family businesses are. They might have opened in the 15th century and be closing in the 21st. Or it might just continue as a butcher shop does. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I'll be very happy to hear your thoughts. You can find me on Instagram at FlemingNeverDies, or you can just email me albionneverdies@gmail.com. Goodbye.